Hi, this is Booked with Emma. I'm Emma, and today I wanted to talk about this book, The Last Séance by Agatha Christie. It's a collection of short stories, and it says here on the front, Tales of the Supernatural. And I was quite skeptical because I did not think that Agatha Christie wrote any supernatural stories. I thought they were all crime. And there was a film a couple of years ago, a Poirot one with Kenneth Branagh, that seemed like it was going to be supernatural and then ended up having a rational explanation. So I was thinking, is this a trick? Are any of these actually supernatural? But actually, they are. A lot of them are. Some of them are supernatural, like definitively. Some of them are crimes, really, where it seems supernatural but there's a rational explanation, and then others are kind of open to interpretation, or sometimes there's a mix of crime but there's an element of the supernatural. I quite enjoyed that because when you're reading them you don't really know what you're getting. Sometimes you can predict, but it just makes the stories overall more varied because some of them are supernatural and you never really know what the explanation is going to be. So I quite enjoyed that about them. Although they are quite varied, there are themes that come up again and again. So premonitions, dreams, hypnosis, mediums and seances, all of those come up a fair amount, but in different ways. Just to illustrate, I'll just go into depth about a couple of stories just to have a bit of an example of what I'm talking about and a bit of a comparison, because both of these stories have premonitions in them. So the first one, In a Glass Darkly, this is about a young man who goes to visit a friend of his and stay with him. And he's staying in one of the bedrooms, and while he's in the bedroom he looks in the mirror and he sees a murder happening. He sees a woman being strangled to death. And then he looks around, there's nothing there. At first he doesn't know if maybe he's seen into a different room, but he establishes that it didn't happen and it was kind of a weird premonition, and then goes down to dinner and meets his friend's sister Sylvia and recognizes her from the premonition as the woman who was being strangled. She is engaged to a man called Charles, and the narrator thinks that he needs to stop them getting married because Charles is gonna strangle Sylvia. He doesn't tell Sylvia about the vision, but they do break up, and then the narrator and Sylvia get together and get married. They start off having a good marriage, but the narrator is quite jealous, and eventually he's kind of suspecting her of affairs. He's quite angry, and he goes to strangle her, sees himself in the mirror strangling her, realizes that the premonition was about him strangling her, and then stops strangling her, and they live happily ever after. I mean, that one was difficult to get on board with because even though he didn't go through with the murder, even with attempted murder, I don't think there's any coming back from that and having a happy marriage. Anyway, that's a story that they live happily ever after. The other one that's kind of the other side of the coin with this story is called Philomel Cottage, and that one is about a woman called Alex. She hasn't had much money and she's been working as a typist for a lot of years, and then she comes into an inheritance of £3,000 or £4,000. While she was a typist for all this time, there's been a man who, he's kind of her boyfriend, but he hasn't wanted to propose to her because he doesn't have any money. So neither of them really had any money all this time. Then she comes into the money and she thinks now they can get married, but he doesn't see the money as a solution because he feels that it's emasculating if she's the one with the money. I don't think it says that explicitly, but that's kind of the general idea. So they are still not getting married, but then she meets this other man, Gerald, and they fall in love very quickly. I think they're engaged within a week, married very quickly. They buy a house in the middle of nowhere, and she has to put some of her money towards the house, and that's quite important. I think he puts 1,000 and she puts 2,000 in, I think. So they go and live in the countryside. She's extremely happy. And then she has this dream, and in the dream, her husband is dead, and she is pleased about it, and she's falling into the arms of her old boyfriend, Dick. So she is alarmed at this because she would not be happy that her husband was dead, and she's worried that Dick is going to come and kill her husband. So then she's quite concerned when Dick rings up and says, "Oh, I'm staying in a pub nearby. I'll come round to your house for dinner and see you both." And she's like, no, you can't come. But then Alex, the wife, bumps into the gardener, and he's working on Wednesday. He doesn't normally work Wednesdays. He normally works Mondays and Fridays. He thought they wouldn't mind if he came on Wednesday because on Friday there's a village fete or something that he wants to go to. And of course, that's fine. She's fine with that. And the gardener says something about, oh, well, you're going to London tomorrow anyway. And Alex is like, we're not going to London. I don't know what made you think that. And he says, yeah, you are, because your husband told me you're going to London. So she's quite puzzled, but she just thinks the gardener is confused and mistaken. And then the gardener also mentions something about at the village fete, he will see the man who used to own the house and who sold it for £2,000. And Alex is like, no, it wasn't 2,000, it was 3,000. And the gardener is like, no, it's definitely 2. He definitely sold it for 2. And Alex is still thinking that the gardener is incorrect about all of this. But then she goes into her husband's things, into his drawer, and then she finds some newspaper clippings that reveal that he is in fact a serial killer. I guess they keep their clippings with their pictures. I wouldn't. If I was trying to hide my true identity as a serial killer, I wouldn't keep the clippings, but there would be no story if this didn't happen. So she realizes her husband's a killer, she realizes that he's after her money, and she realizes that he is going to kill her tonight, and then he's going to go to London or wherever and come back and say she stayed in London or something when she'll actually be dead. So now she doesn't know how to get out of getting murdered. She does try the obvious, leave before her husband gets home, but then he catches her on the way out. So she has to do some quick thinking. I won't spoil how she does it, but it's quite clever. Reminded me a bit of, if you saw Charlie's Angels, the old series, one episode that for some reason stands out where one of the angels, I think Kelly, was in an aeroplane, like a tiny aeroplane that didn't have a roof, and she was with the killer. The killer was flying the plane. She realised that he'd cut her seatbelt or something, so when he went upside down, she'd just fall out and be killed. And then she took the belt off her jeans and put it through the loops and fashioned it into a seatbelt. I don't know why that one sticks out to me, but I've always remembered it. This story kind of reminded me a little bit of Charlie's Angels, of how they had to be a bit resourceful to get out of these situations sometimes. Those two stories, I just liked the kind of contrast between them both having the premonitions, but they're both quite different stories, and the premonitions are used quite differently in each story. And the whole collection is like that, where there is repetition of themes, but there's not really a repetition of plot. My favourite story in this collection is called The Dressmaker's Doll. That one is about women who work in a dressmaker's shop and a doll that appears. And when they first notice the doll, they all think it's been there a while, but no one can remember when they got it or how, and no one likes it. And then it does creepy things, like even if they lock the door, it moves. And obviously they're scared of the doll, as anyone would be. Dolls are the creepiest, I think. The only one I didn't like in this whole collection was one called The Wife of the Kenite. And that one is around themes of war and invasion and cruelty to civilians and atrocities that are done to civilians. And then it's kind of a revenge story. I found that one a lot harder to read than the stories that are just about murder, that are kind of about murder but kind of also fun and lighthearted in a way. The Wife of the Kenite was just not at all lighthearted, and it was really more of a true horror, in the sense that you're horrified by what you're reading rather than being scared about what might happen. And it's all very unpleasant and also just a bit too close to home, I think, when things are too realistic. So that was the only one I didn't like. I don't know why that one was in the collection. I'd have left it out. Overall, I really enjoyed this collection. I definitely recommend it. Even though some of these stories were written 100 years ago, or more than 100 years ago, it's very easy to read, very enjoyable to read for the most part. There are a few kind of cultural differences, like some of the language that they used that was normal then that means something completely different now. I don't think I can even say them all on here, but for example, people talk about knocked up, meaning being kind of taken ill rather than being pregnant, or someone suggests having an orgy and I think it just seems to mean like a party. So there were a few things like that that were just slightly jarring, and then you just realise what they actually mean, and it's fine. Also, how names change. Like, there's a woman in one of the stories called Alistair, and when I was reading it, I was like, what's the woman called though? And who's Alistair? And then I realised Alistair was just the woman's name. So I guess at the time that was more of a typical name for a woman, I guess. In terms of things that could be offensive, there are definitely some racial stereotypes. There's a lot of talking about Asian people, particularly being connected to magic. There's one quote where it says, "She has Eastern blood, and I should say possesses marked occult powers." That type of thing where people from the East are kind of mysterious and magical, which I just think is indicative of the times. I didn't find it particularly offensive. And I know I did say in my Stephen King video that one thing I don't like about him is when he will use racially offensive terms, not just racially offensive, other offensive terms. And he says, well, I'm just reflecting the reality of something that exists. The difference for me is that he makes a choice to bring racist characters or other offensive characters and language into the books, whereas Agatha Christie was just writing as anyone would at that time, and there was no point where she thought, I'm going to use an offensive stereotype here. No, it's just, you know, it's 100 years ago, things were slightly different. I did get slightly worried because in the first story, it's about a medium, and she says she's kind of afraid of the client who's coming in. She's like, I'm scared of her. She's so big and black. And I thought, oh, okay. But actually it was nothing to do with ethnicity. It was the woman's in mourning and she wears all these black veils. There were a few weird gender things. The one about the man having a happy marriage after nearly killing his wife, I was a bit taken aback by that one. But I did think actually in the other one, the Philomel Cottage story with the serial killer husband, that I was reading it thinking that's a red flag. They've got married very quickly. They've moved to the middle of nowhere. That's a red flag. And it was a red flag. And Agatha Christie knew 100 years ago that these things were red flags. So it's kind of interesting how things in a lot of ways haven't changed. I did notice something that was slightly annoying, which was a disparity in how men and women are described in terms of being young and old, because in the first story there's a Frenchman called Raoul and he is described as a 32-year-old young man. Then in the Wife of the Kenite, the story I didn't like, the woman in that is described as being not young, nearer 40 than 30. So I was like, okay, so either women in their 30s are old and men in their 30s are young, or there's a particular age somewhere between 32 and 35 when you go from being young to old. It wasn't a big deal at all. I just noticed that while I was reading and I was like, slightly unfair. The only other thing that I could criticize in this collection is that there's probably an over-reliance on people dying of shock. That happens a few times. I'm not sure how realistic dying of shock is. It's probably possible, but I think it probably doesn't happen in real life quite as much as it happens in these stories. But I have to give Agatha Christie credit here because Miss Marple even talks about this. I forgot to say, but Miss Marple and Poirot both in a few stories in this collection, so it's nice to see them crop up. I didn't realise Miss Marple, I haven't read any Miss Marple stories before, only seen them on TV, and I didn't realise she seems to solve all the crimes by not being there. She just hears a story and then is like, I know what's happened here. Whereas Poirot actually goes to the place and investigates. Anyway, Miss Marple is talking about how she would kill someone if she was going to kill someone. And she says, I shouldn't be at all satisfied to trust a fright. I know one reads of people dying of it, but it seems a very uncertain sort of thing. I should like something definite and certain and make a thoroughly good plan about it. So I liked that even Miss Marple said, don't just plan on people dying of fright. But in these stories, it does happen quite frequently, but I didn't mind. It was quite fun still. So overall, I really recommend this collection if you're interested in supernatural stories, or just if you're an Agatha Christie fan and you want to see her doing something different, because it's quite fun. And like I said, 100 years on for a lot of these stories, and they still stand up as really great stories today. If you've read any of Agatha Christie's supernatural stories, please let me know. If you have a favourite, please let me know what you thought. I would be really interested to hear what you think. And thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.